All right, folks, I think we're back. Okay, here we go. I just need, sorry about that, folks. Had multiple things all happen at once. The connection between my streaming software and YouTube got lost, and then on top of that, my internet went down for a little while. So sorry about that. Share my screen, and we can get back to presentation. All right, I should be back to should be able to see the screen again. I'm gonna back up here. Just waiting for confirmation from my assistant that you can see the screen, and then we'll get back into it. Apologize for that lengthy delay. Had multiple technical issues happen kind of simultaneously, so always a bummer when that happens. Okay, so I have confirmation that we can see it, and okay, here we go, folks. Sorry about that. Appreciate your patience for those who are still on. All right, so some assumptions. I'm just going to go over these again. First, you are already gardening this year or you've gardened before, so I'm not going to do a lot of introductory, basic beginner gardener stuff. Second is that you're not starting a new garden plot now. This means that you already have garden space that is ready to plant in, because I'm not going to cover some of the preparatory stuff you need to do if you're creating a new garden spot. And lastly, that you are new to the practice of fall gardening, i.e. you haven't planted a fall garden before, or you've done it before, but you want to improve and learn new things. So hopefully everybody falls into that category. Okay, so let's start with considerations. We're going to talk about soil, location, sunlight, temperature, and season length. These are all things you need to think about when you're planning your fall garden. The first is soil. Now, the qualities in soil that you want, and this is the same for spring gardening and fall gardening, but I'm emphasizing you need a high organic matter content and a balanced pH. The ideal type of soil structure is sandy loam. If you don't have that, that's okay. Basically, you can typically compensate by just adding more organic material. So lots of compost. Keep adding compost. If your soil is subpar and is not ideal, then you're going to need to keep adding organic matter. You can do this as you plant, either by digging holes and putting good compost in the hole that you're planting your seeds or your transplant into. Or you can also, I've done before, where I'll basically dig a deep furrow and put basically compost in it and plant into that. Basically, you just want to have really high organic matter soil, particularly for young seedlings, so that they thrive early on. One thing that is important all the time, but even more so in the fall, is that you mulch well. Mulch helps to retain moisture, and in the fall, it also helps to retain soil temperature. It helps keep the plants warmer than if it was just exposed to earth. So you definitely want to mulch well, whether that is with wood chips like you see here, or grass clippings, or rotted leaves, or even fresh leaves, whatever you're using for your compost. I'm sorry, for your mulch. Mulching will help control weeds and keep the moisture in the soil where the plants need it. All right, location. again, I mentioned this presentation isn't designed to talk about where to put in. Like if you're about this, you have to take into consideration the characteristics of the garden plot that you're dealing with. Okay, so sunlight and wind are the primary determinants of the impact of your garden, particularly in the fall as the temperatures start to cool. Because as the angle of the sun changes, the shade might be an issue, as well as the fact that the direction of the slope, if you have one, will determine how long the soil will stay warm in the fall. In other words, if you have a south to southwest facing slope, you're going to have the longest season compared to any other slope face that you have in that particular microclimate where you're at. Okay, so a north slope is going to cool quicker in the fall, and a south slope or southwest slope is going to stay warmer longer because it's getting more sunlight. The angle of the sun coming down is basically collecting more sun. Okay, if you have trees, shade will be an issue in the summer, especially near the summer solstice. You have small shadows because the sun is close to overhead in the northern hemisphere. As you get further into the fall, those shadows get longer and the pattern of the shadows change. So you need to take that into account, particularly if you're planting certain plants that may want more sun or more heat. Also, wind can drop temperature significantly. This is definitely the case where we live in the mountains of Virginia in a high mountain valley. The predominant prevailing winds come out of the west from the lower elevation mountains in West Virginia, and they hit the Allegheny Mountain Ridge and come up. And then our valley is one of the first wider valleys, and it's also relatively close to the ridge lines. So we get a lot of wind right in the middle of the valley. And so you can have significant wind chill, especially as winter weather patterns pick up where you have more cold wind coming. Okay, so look for wind blocks, and particularly if you are going to be putting in new garden plots in the future. Wind blocks are particularly helpful in transition seasons like early spring or in late fall, where you have colder wind that will cause significant wind chills. And as you can see here, I'm using some plastic covering over some of the garden space. We'll talk about that as a form of season extension later in the presentation. Real quick about space available. The amount of space you have available is not necessarily just the amount of space you have in your garden plot, because that sun exposure and the shade pattern that you have in your particular location might make it such that certain parts of your garden are not really suitable for growing most crops. They may only be suitable for certain crops that can handle colder temperatures and shade in the cooler months as you go into the fall. So you want to take that sun exposure into account, particularly for what kinds of plants you're going to plant where in your garden. Also realize that this space that you have may inform whether you're doing rows or square foot gardening, right? So this kind of goes for if you're planting in the spring garden, but let's say that you already have your spring garden, summer garden planted, and maybe you've got a new plot or another part of your garden you haven't planted yet, or maybe you started a new area on your property that's going to be a new garden, and it's already ready to go. Square foot gardening is good for smaller spaces. I find that row gardening is better for larger spaces, in particular because it makes irrigation much easier. It's a lot easier to irrigate rows where you can use drip tape than it is raised beds, unless you have long raised beds where you can basically use the same type of geometry for drip tapes or something like that. It's a lot harder to irrigate a bunch of small square boxes that are raised and elevated and separated from each other. So it can be done. However, I just want to make the point that, if you're doing raised bed boxes and they're smaller and you've got a bunch of small ones, it's going to be harder to irrigate that space as it would if you had either row garden where you had a row across the long axis of the garden, or you had a raised bed that was like one continuous bed, maybe 4 feet wide, which is pretty typical for a raised bed because you can reach a couple feet from each side. You can run irrigation drip tape, or which is what I use, or soaker hoses, or whatever kind of irrigation you're using along the long axis of that bed. Much more difficult to do if you're having raised beds. So the shape and size of your garden space will help determine what is best for you in that particular situation. As I mentioned earlier, sunlight is a big factor, especially in the transition months of spring and fall. Soil with more sun stays warm the longest, so a south to southwest facing slope gets the highest angle of sun and therefore collects the most solar energy. A north facing slope, of course I'm talking about in the northern hemisphere, which is where most of you are at. A north facing slope has a shallower angle of sunlight and therefore cannot collect as much solar energy. So if you have the ability to, if you have a slope and you can put your garden on that kind of a slope, that's going to be most helpful. As I mentioned, sunlight is most important as temperatures. The primary to you is to your benefit and to the benefit of your plants, particularly when you're using season extension methods I'm going to talk about later. Okay, temperature. This is one of the big reasons that you should be growing a fall garden. It's that because certain crops grow best in cooler temperatures, and in particular, their fruit matures best in cooler temps. And this is not just things like peas that don't do well in summer heat and that typically do well in, I grow my best peas in the fall, plant them in the late summer, and by the time they're starting to mature, the temperatures are cooling and moderating, and they're in that ideal temperature range that they really like to grow in, and so they grow really fast and mature really well, as opposed to maturing into hot summer heat that they don't like. Also, any kind of leafy green is going to taste better in cooler temperatures. Typically, they will typically be more tender, and if you've had frost and it's a frost tolerant variety, which kales and collard greens, Asian greens, those kind of things are, typically it's going to concentrate sugars in the leaves, in the foliage, so it's going to taste sweeter as well and be more flavorful. Spinach also likes that cooler weather, most greens, and also root crops. They will have a concentrated sugar content after they've had frost exposure. So that's one reason to grow things like carrots, and beets and other things into the fall. Carrots in particular, which can tolerate frost pretty well. Temperatures. This is pretty important because as temperatures fall and get cooler, the amount of time it's going to take for your crops to mature is going to take longer than it would if you were planting them earlier in the year, where they're maturing in summer temperatures. Okay, so you have to adjust dates, your dates to maturity in your planting calculations to know when they're going to actually mature, and particularly so that you make sure that they mature before your frost comes if it's a non-frost tolerant variety of crop. Usually a 2-week adjustment is a good planting factor. In other words, most crops, if you basically add 2 weeks, so you would plant 2 weeks earlier than you otherwise would, or add 2 weeks to the days to maturity, so 14, 15 days, that will usually be a suitable accommodation for the slowing of growth that happens late in the season. Lastly, season length. This is important to know more so in like in the winter when you're planting your garden for the year, or in the spring season. But in particular, any long season crop, this is going to be particularly important because if you live pretty far north, then there's some crops you're not going to be able to grow, or you're not going to be able to grow after a certain date. Okay. So the dates that you use to determine your season length are basically your 2 frost dates, your last average spring frost and your first average fall frost. The reason why these are used for what defines the season length is because the majority of vegetable crops grown in gardens, annual crops, are not frost tolerant. and therefore, you know, at some point in the fall, you're going to have what they call a killing frost, which is like a hard frost. It's not just a light frost, but it's something that's going to kill most things, unless they're cold tolerant, like certain brassicas, cabbage, collard greens, those kind of things can tolerate pretty severe frost, but most things cannot. Lettuce, and a lot of other greens and other things just can't tolerate the frost. It'll kill them. So this is what defines the season length. The key word here is average. These dates, depending on where you get them, may not be accurate for where you're at. There can be large variances with microclimates. And where we're at in the mountains of Virginia is a good example of this. We're about 20 to 25 miles west of Roanoke. And even though we're not very far from Roanoke, and Roanoke may even be one of the closest places that we can get published data for these dates, for these spring and fall frost dates, our microclimate is so significantly different. Then there can be a difference of 2 to 3 weeks in the spring and 2 to 3 weeks in the fall. So we can be a month to 6 weeks difference in our overall season length because of the difference in microclimate. The Roanoke Valley is down below 1,000 feet elevation. We're up at 2,500 feet elevation. We get a lot of wind and more winter weather here, more significant winter weather here than they get. Our microclimate is actually like northern Pennsylvania. It's most similar to northern Pennsylvania than it is to most of Virginia. So how do you figure out then what is good average spring or fall frost dates? Well, you can look up published data and use some tweak to those numbers based upon what you know about the variation. However, one of the best ways to do is to check maybe with your local ag extension. Sometimes they'll have some microclimate data that they might be, or some guidance they can give you that will help. But probably the best source of data is going to be neighbors, particularly neighbors that have lived there for many years, decades, or even generations. We live in a place where there's a lot of homesteads. Some families in our valley where we live have been here for over 200 years. So they have long histories of growing crops here. And so they have certain best practices that they use. One of them is that they don't plant the stuff in the garden. And this would be things like, you know, beans and warmer weather crops, not cool weather crops, but beans and corn and that kind of stuff. They don't plant them before Mother's Day. Now, Mother's Day changes a little bit on the calendar, but typically you're talking first or second week of May. That's the general like date that they use on the calendar around here, and that I've seen that to be relatively largely true, but I wouldn't be able to get that data if I looked online for it because there's really not a good microclimate data source that we can use, and that might be the case where you live as well. So make sure that you're asking around, and it's always good to get to know your neighbors, especially those who are also fellow gardeners. Generally, your season length is the difference between those two frost dates, like I mentioned, okay? All right, let's move on to planning factors. Always plan for children being around in the garden. That's the first one. No. Okay, so frost dates. I talked about frost dates a minute ago. That's important to know. A lot of people see this map, or they hear people asking about, or they themselves ask about, what is your zone that you live in? And while knowing your zone is a good thing to know, it's important to know what this USDA published plant hardiness zone map is. It is important to know your zone, but you need to know that it is actually for perennial plants, not for annual vegetable crops. And the reason why, because what this nice colored map depicts is the extreme minimum temperature in locations across the United States or in other places if you have a similar map you're looking at. The legend on the right is looking at data over a 30-year period, looking at the extreme minimum temperature. So what this is looking at is if it's a perennial plant like flower bulbs or trees or shrubs, will it survive the winter there? That's what the zone is talking about. And while it can sometimes correlate to like when you might plant stuff, annual crops in the spring, it really is not a good measure of how you do that. You need to know your frost dates. And for the fall, you need to know not your zone, because that doesn't tell you when the frost happens. It just tells you what the extreme minimum temperature is. You need to know when your first average fall frost date is, so then you can calculate when is the latest you need to plant your fall crops by in order to get a harvest before that first fall frost comes. Okay, so let's talk about lead times and how to calculate these. I'm going to do 5 common cool weather crops that people would plant in a fall garden. And we're going to use a first average fall frost date of October 15th in this example. So broccoli, popular cool weather crop, you need to plant that 13 weeks before the fall frost date. If you're planting them inside or in trays, you don't necessarily have to be inside if it's in the summer, but you're going to be starting those June 25th and then plant those outside about 9 weeks before the fall frost date. Okay. The other things here, ground. You might do spinach or lettuce indoors, but typically it's going to be planted in the ground because it's warm enough to germinate there. All right, so lettuce you're going to do 10 weeks prior, and you can do that basically in August. If October 15th is your first frost date, second week August is when you're going to plant your lettuce. Your peas 15 weeks before the fall frost. They're a little slower, so you have to plant them in July. So if this is your full frost date, you're already behind the power curve. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't still grow peas, but I would be prepared to cover them somehow when you have frosts in the fall, if you're going to do that. But the rest of these, spinach, 8 weeks, turnip, 9 weeks, basically gives you early August planting dates. So one of the reasons I'm doing this training now is because we're at that time of year where you need to be planting your fall crops in the garden so that you can get a harvest before the frost comes. Some notes. These are the latest dates without frost protection. If you use frost protection, then it will give you, depending on the type of frost protection you're using and other factors, it could give you 2 or more weeks onto those numbers in terms of how late you can plant them before they won't make it anymore. And honestly, some things like turnips, they're pretty hardy, pretty frost tolerant, even broccoli. So it's important to note, though, that even things that are frost tolerant, like brassicas, once you have frosts and cold weather, their growth slows way down. So it's important that you get them started and established well before the cold weather comes. Now, if you're doing successive plantings, it doesn't mean you have to wait till these dates, right? You can do them earlier. So if lettuce, you should be planting, if you have this fresh salad from lettuce salad all the time, you really should be doing successive plantings, every 2 to 3 weeks throughout the summer until about this date or whatever you calculate as your latest planting date before the fall frost comes, because that will mean that you're not just having one big group at the end of the season, but you're going to be having lettuce throughout that time. And as I mentioned before, frost protection is going to give you the ability to push that latest date further into the future. All right. Choosing varieties. People ask, well, what should I grow? Well, the first thing is to grow what you eat. If you're not going to eat it, don't grow it, unless you're not sure if you're going to like it or not and you're doing it for a test. I highly recommend growing things that you haven't grown before or that you're not sure if you like. Even if it's something that you got from the grocery store and you hated it, it very well may be because it was grown in California, picked a month before it was ripe, shipped across the country, and sat on a store shelf before you picked it up at the grocery store on the East Coast of the U.S. and took it home and ate it. That's probably not going to be very tasty because it didn't ever ripen. You didn't actually ever have fresh food or ripe food. So always try new things. With that said, plant what you are going to eat and also prefer heirloom varieties. Now, I don't say this just because we sell heirloom seeds, but there are so many thousands and thousands of different heirloom varieties that are super interesting and often, very, very prolific, productive, very tasty, nutritious, that there's always new ones to try, and you should always be testing new varieties anyways, because you might find a new favorite or one that does particularly well in your garden spot. So I recommend that people always grow heirlooms, because this is what we do, in part because we save seeds and we sell them, but also because there's just so many neat varieties that we're always trying out new ones and always experimenting. I don't find the need to do hybrids very much unless it is to address a specific challenge I'm having, particularly pest or disease problems. Disease problems in particular, if there's some kind of like fungal disease that you have, or maybe you have, say, blight on your tomatoes a lot or something, maybe you might get a hybrid variety that is more resistant to blight. But typically you can find an heirloom variety that addresses those issues and which is still going to produce well for you. And so it's just a matter of finding the right varieties. Also, you want to optimize production for your space. So here's a few tips. Veggies that will grow well in cool temps are something you want to focus on for the fall, obviously. Leafy greens, any kind of brassica pretty much. Beets, root crops like carrots and turnips. If you have enough time, plant winter squash if you still have enough time. There's some shorter season winter squash that will mature in only about 70 or 80 days, and you might still have time if you're far south enough. And I say winter squash in particular because, you know, as long as the fruit gets mature, they'll just keep growing until they're done, or, you know, the fall frost comes. So, and the nice thing is about winter squash, kind of like root crops, is that if you store them in the proper conditions, they don't need refrigeration in order to store them. And winter squash actually last a lot longer and are easier to store than root crops like carrots or beets or those kind of things that tend to get more soft, and you have to put them in the right moist conditions to keep them keep their turgor in the cell walls, because that winter squash have that hard shell. You can keep them in your basement or another cool spot. Heck, I think we still have some butternut and spaghetti squash from last year, and that's basically like 10 months old. So, and you know, they're going to be just as good as when we picked them. Peas also, I mentioned, they grow really well. Any kind of greens, lettuce, spinach, other types of Asian greens. I highly recommend Asian greens. They tend to do really well. Some of them are part of the brassica family. Many of them are part of the mustard family. If you have veggies with multiple edible parts, this is great. Turnips in the South are a tradition, turnip greens. One of the reasons for that is because during the war between the states, when the Union Army was proceeding to completely demolish and destroy the Southern economy, like destroy everything, basically, Sherman's march through Georgia. They basically were starving because all the food had been destroyed, all the animals had been destroyed, they didn't have anything to eat. So they had to plant what would grow quickly, and turnips grow very quickly in harvest, not too much, and their root will still develop. So they could have greens in the summer and still basically be able to harvest the turnip root for storage through the winter. And so when your animal crops are destroyed and all other things are destroyed, and you're having to start things fresh before the winter comes, you have to be creative, and turnips are one of the things that really mitigated the starvation that was going on in the South during the war, at the end of the war there. So turnips and turnip greens. Also, beets are another one. I didn't put it on here as a bullet, but you see with the picture here, you can harvest beet greens, especially when they're young and tender. You can put them in salads. You can cook them like you would chard or other greens in a cooked green saute or something like that. But you want to consider the days to maturity or maturation days versus your season length when you're doing that, right? So you don't want to plant things that are not going to fully mature, particularly if there's something like a root crop or something. You don't want to plant beets like 3 weeks before the fall frost, because they're just not going to get established and develop much of a root before the weather gets too cold. All right, a couple tips here about layout. I mentioned earlier, you want to orient your garden to the south if you're in the northern hemisphere to get the maximum amount of sunlight. In particular, what you want to do is you want to put your tallest plants in the back or the north side of the garden, unless shade is needed. And for fall gardens, typically shade is not needed. Shade is typically only useful in the heat of the summer to shade plants like lettuce that tend to bolt in summer heat. So if you're planting different height plants, typically, especially for a fall garden, you want to put the tallest in the back, the shortest in the front, so they're not shading each other and they're all getting sunlight, which is what they're going to need for both photosynthesis as well as for heat. Another thing to do is consider companion planting to create synergy between your plants and increase the productivity of them. This is an example of a raised bed I did a few years ago where I had beans in the center surrounded by lettuce with carrots on the outside. And basically the space between them right now is going to get filled in once they get mature. But each of these plants have certain beneficial companions that they can be grown next to. And I highly recommend looking into that if you haven't already. We have a companion plant that you can download that gives you a quick reference for that. I don't have a link handy in this presentation, but if you're interested, let me know and I'll follow up with you to get that to you. Want to make sure that you ensure adequate access for harvesting. If you have tight space in your garden, it's important that you leave room for paths or access to be able to get to your crops. If you're doing row gardens or raised beds and you're looking at how wide should I make my bed, obviously the more paths you have, the less bed space you have. I wouldn't recommend making the bed more than about 5 feet wide. 4 feet is pretty standard because you can easily reach 2 feet from each side. If it's beyond 5, then you have to have pretty long arms to be able to get to the middle without stepping in the growing bed. And you don't want to do that because you don't want to compact the soil. So just a tip to make sure that you have space to be able to get in and harvest your crops. All right, lastly, let's talk about some variables. These are things you control. So I talked a little bit about successive plantings earlier. This is where you basically plant more than once. So, a lot of people plant a garden in the spring and then they don't do anything the rest of the summer except weed. And then sometimes they get tired of that and just give up on that as well. But the easiest way that most people that I know or see or talk to can get more out of their garden is just by using this one principle, which is successive plantings. And if you think about it, a fall garden is actually a form of successive planting, right? You're going to plant again in the late summer your fall crops that, at a minimum, if you only do a spring garden and a fall garden, you've done like one successive planting. I'd recommend doing it routinely over and over again throughout the summer, particularly for things that you're going to be harvesting on a regular basis, like lettuce, like I mentioned before. But you can optimize your space available in your garden by planting again after harvesting the first crop grown in the space. This is particularly useful when you're harvesting root vegetables like beets, or carrots, or onions, or garlic. As soon as you pull those things out, you can plant seed in that spot and get another crop out of the same spot. Or if you want to get more time productivity out of that space, you can have already started seedlings ahead of time. And when you harvest that crop, you can put a transplant a seedling into that space and gives it a jump start over planting it by seed. Good things to think about with successive plantings. You can really maximize your production if you're using effective use of transplanting, like I mentioned. Very good for salad greens. Like I mentioned, you can plant every 2 to 3 weeks. Those radishes grow really fast. Most radishes are ready in about 3 weeks, typically not more than 4, unless it's a slow growing radish like a daikon radish, which get huge, like 1 to 2 feet long. So they're super big. They take more like 6 or 7 weeks, but radishes typically only take a few weeks to grow. So if you can plant radishes next to another crop that grows slower, like carrots or even lettuce, you'll be able to harvest those and get them out of the way by the time that the other crop is maturing enough and growing out and filling the space. So that's one way that you can get more productivity out of your space. Don't just plan your spacing and what you actually plant based upon the size it's going to be at full maturity. If you grow quick growing crops like radishes in particular, because they're the fastest, is the easiest example I have to use. you can basically harvest those, get them out of the way by the time that the lettuce or whatever is next to it is filling out. It hasn't even really started getting into the place where the radishes were by the time you harvested them. All right, last is season extension. I want to talk about some different methods of season extension and things to consider. So what season extension does is it gives you frost protection and also a way to create a microclimate that is warmer than what the outside ambient air temperature might or microclimate may create. Okay, so most common, unless you're talking about a fixed season extension like a high tunnel or greenhouse of some sort, if you're using a temporary season extension covering, the most common thing to use is a permeable fabric. Typically uses a row cover. They're anywhere from 5 or 6 feet wide up to, can be much wider than that. It can be used as a floating row cover, it's often referred to, or it can be used over some kind of a hoop that provides a structure to keep the row cover off of the plants. And that's what you want to use if you have anything that's tender or might break under the weight of a row cover. You can also use plastic on row covers or cold frames as a means of trapping that heat and keeping it in. Just realize that with permeable fabrics, they do allow some temperature exchange. Plastic does not do that as well. So if you're using plastic, you need to make sure that you ventilate so that you don't cook your crops essentially in a solar oven. Also, glass is used on cold frames, the more traditional types, as the means of preserving that heat and solar energy. Okay, so glass and plastic, if you're using those two methods or those two materials instead of a permeable fabric, they need ventilation during the day. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it, unless it's a really cold day where there's lots of wind or something. Even then, you're probably going to need at least a minimal amount of ventilation to keep the heat from building up too hot inside of your, what are typically referred to as low tunnels. That's what you're seeing here on a farm setting. On the left, in the back, are high tunnels, and the ones on the center and right are low tunnels, which are basically hoops with fabric over them. Using these methods, in particular, the easiest, the low tunnel, extend harvesting into the winter. I actually was able to extend harvest of lettuce into December in New Jersey, even though there was snow and lots of frost and stuff. In fact, the only reason that I wasn't able to extend it into Christmas is that we had a windstorm and it tore off part of the plastic that I had over my hoops and basically flash froze my lettuce. So, but you can do this fairly economically yourself in your garden, both with row gardens, which is most common for, but also with any kind of raised bed. You can also basically put a row cover over it. Another method of season extension is transplanting. Most people don't think of it that way, but if you are in the spring and a lot of people start seeds indoors, what are they doing? They're extending their season earlier in the year by starting their seeds inside in a warm growing environment because it's too cold to start them outside. That's season extension. If you're using frost protection, there's a couple of different options. A greenhouse, this could be a commercial high tunnel, which would be great for lots of people. I'm sure would love to have one. I'd love to have one. Don't have one yet. But you can also build a budget greenhouse or high tunnel. In this case, I would call this a hoop house. This is one I built about 8-9 years ago when we first moved to the mountains of Virginia, and I grew tomatoes in it. I was actually able to grow tomatoes in this hoop house into November. We actually had fresh tomatoes at Thanksgiving. So, and this was probably less than $200 in materials. It's basically PVC pipes, 20-foot spans for the arch, for the hoops, and then 6 mil plastic and some other stuff basically to hold it in place. So it wasn't too expensive. Cold frames are another method. These are great for growing any kind of leafy greens that you're going to harvest on a regular basis. In this picture from a few years ago, my youngest son Levi was helping me install a simple cold frame built with wooden framing material and 6 mil plastic wrapping around it. So it worked pretty well. We were growing, it looks like collard greens and kale in this green. And in the back there, we had lettuce, and I think there was some celery, and maybe some chard as well. Here's an example of a cold frame using hay bale. Hay bales for the structure, or straw bales. I'm not sure which. Looks like straw bales actually, but straw bales have a huge insulative value. So it's nice because it holds in the heat. And then there's just a simple frame with looks like 1x4 lumber with probably 6 mil plastic stretched over it. And they basically have it, instead of elevating the frame to ventilate, they've got a long PVC pipe that's attached to the bottom of the plastic, and they basically can roll the plastic up. So this is another way, and another example of a cold frame. And this looks like they're probably using it in the spring for starting early crops. But you could do the same thing in the fall. If you just had beds inside of this thing, you could grow in it and grow leafy greens and things like that into the winter. Low tunnels I mentioned before. This example looks like plastic and these pre-bent wire frames to go over the beds. On the right here is an example of a low tunnel inside of a high tunnel. And this double protection method is actually what farmer Elliot Coleman uses in Maine to grow leafy greens all winter long. His primary growing season is actually in the fall through the spring, and he grows inside of unheated greenhouses like this leafy greens for sale to restaurants and to market by using double protection, a low tunnel covered with fabric, all that's got greenhouse plastic on it. So that's another example of how you can use low tunnels. Clochets are a European method. It's a French word. On the right here is a traditional looking clocher, which looks like a bell. It's basically a little glass enclosure that you put over individual plants. This is particularly useful in the spring when you've got transplants in the garden and you're going to have a frost. You can basically cover them. We actually did this with our asparagus this spring using mason jars. We just took a bunch of mason jars out there and stuck them over the asparagus to cover them on the night we were going to have a frost so that it protected them, and it worked like a champ. So that's an example of another season extension method. Lastly, you can use a heat mass, like a structure, to provide a heating effect and a microclimate for your plants. In this picture, what we have is a flower bed against a brick building, what is most likely facing south. So south would be to our left in this picture, most likely. But they've got tomatoes, they're planted at the base of those stakes, and what looks like peppers and maybe eggplant or something in front of that. But what they're using here is the principle that the heating of the sun during the day, the solar energy is absorbed by the bricks, and then as the sun goes down, the bricks will release some of that heat into the air nearby, thereby creating a microclimate buffer near the building. And so I would imagine that the temperature near those tomatoes is probably about 5 to maybe 10 degrees warmer than it would be out in the yard outside this building at night, because of the fact that it has this heat mass next to it, that it's and this is not even being covered, right? The same principle can be used inside of something like a high tunnel or a greenhouse, where you have barrels of water or other heat masses that are inside there that basically soak up heat during the day and then release it at night. And they help to regulate the temperature swings inside the structure. All right, well, that's the last point that I had on our fall garden planning. Some of the calculations we did earlier can be laborious, but we've got a free fall garden planning calculator that you can use to easily calculate your planting dates. You just plug in your first fall frost date in the orange cell, and it automatically calculates all your other dates when you need to plant. So if you want to get that, you can click, go to seedsgenerations.com/FPC. And I can't remember if we put the link on this page or not, but you can also find it in the navigation on our website. If you go to our main website and go under resources, the links to our fall planting calculator are there, as well as our garden planning calculator for the spring. But obviously, the fall planting calculator is the one we're doing right now since we're planting fall crops. All right. Let me see here. Oh, yeah. What about the seeds? Obviously, we've got seeds that we want to share from our family to yours. Our kids, planting, weeding, watering, harvesting, but seed processing and packing seeds and order fulfillment. They basically do everything except for the online stuff, though I'm hoping to introduce some of them to that soon. So we'd love to share with you. We're actually starting a fall gardening sale right now. Y'all are the first to hear about this. So you can get seeds to plant in your fall garden, and we've got discounts on selected seeds. There's several dozen, I think probably 40 or 50 different varieties that we have on sale. Plus, if you want, we have a premium version of that fall planting calculator I mentioned a minute ago that is not only has some additional data on it, including like season extension data, but it also is downloadable, and you can basically save it and print it more easily at home. You can get that by using code FallGardening40 during checkout, and if your seed order is $40 or more, then that will enable you to get that premium fall planting calculator for free. It's normally a $10 tool that we sell on the website. You can go to seedsgenerations.com/fallgarden to go to the sale page and see the varieties that we have on sale, or you can click the banner below the video to take a look at the details. All right. It's time for questions. If you haven't already entered your questions, please do so now, and I will answer them in order that we have received them. And if you have to jump off, don't feel bad. Thanks for showing up, everybody. We appreciate your time. But I am going to stick around for a little bit. I can't have, I do have something I have to run to, so I can only probably do about 10 minutes of questions. But if we didn't get to them, we will follow up by email to answer your question if we don't get it to it live right now. All right, let me pull this up. Oh, there it is. Okay, sorry, I had to find the questions that. All right, here we go. Okay, so here we go. One other thing here before I jump in. Put the link at the bottom there. Okay, so Craig asked, what effect will row covers have on various plantings? Well, typically they're going to increase. Most row covers, the fabric kind, the permeable fabric kind, are going to give you anywhere from a couple degrees of frost protection to up to maybe 5 to 7. It's not a huge amount. It's definitely not as much as like a thick plastic, like a 6 mil plastic would. So the primary thing it's going to do is give you some frost protection. So if you're going to have a light frost, or let's say a frost where it gets down maybe not into the 20s, maybe down to 31, 30, something like that, it's going to basically protect those plants from getting frost. Also important to note, which is not the purpose of this conversation, but row cover is also going to be used for insect control. So that you can also use them for that to keep the insects off of your plants. In particular, worms that have they lay, the moths fly around and lay, like, like cabbage worms. They lay their eggs on the plants, and then they hatch out, and then they start eating everything in sight. You can control those by putting row cover over them. So that's another use of that same material. So it's going to give you frost protection. It's also going to add a little bit of heating, so it'll give a little bit of warmer microclimate underneath it. So those are the primary use for row covers. It's going to be more important for some than others. It's going to be more important for things like lettuce that's damaged by frost than it is for a more cold tolerant leafy green like kale. So I think that's the best answers I have for that question. Helen asks, what is best to grow in a raised bed in the fall besides greens? If you can get them planted early enough, peas are great. The best peas are grown in the fall because they like cooler temperatures when they're maturing. So if you can get them planted early enough, the fall peas are way better than summer peas, typically, depending on your microclimate, but that's my experience. So peas are definitely one. I would say also any kind of root crop. Beets, carrots are all great to plant. There's really nothing better than carrots that have been harvested after a few frosts, because the frosts concentrate the sugars in the root, and the sweetest carrots are always like harvested in the winter. We even had some carrots that overwintered in our garden, and when we harvested them in the spring after they kind of came back to life and grew some more, also super sweet. So carrots is one I would also recommend. Lori asks, will you cover plant disease and pests? I'm asking because I'm battling cabbage moths and here. I'm also a fledgling composter. Any advice on that would be great. So let me just hit real quick. Pests, cabbage moths or cabbage worms, any kind of worm, the best insecticide to use, organic insecticide, is called BT. It's a short for Bacillus thuringiensis. It's basically a bacteria that kills the worms. It's a wide spectrum worm insecticide. It doesn't work on other insects, it just works on worms in the worm stage, but works on pretty much any worms. So you can get that in a concentrate form and basically dilute it in water and spray it on your worms. Powdery mildew, any kind of mildew or fungal type disease is an issue of one, the disease spores being present, and two, the amount of moisture. So if you're having a lot of rain, it's really hard to control because the rain's falling in the sky and getting everything wet, right? If you're watering, you're not having an excessive amount of rain, but you're watering, highly recommend using like drip tape or something where you're watering right on the ground via a drip method, as opposed to watering with a sprinkler, an overhead sprinkler, or a hand sprayer or something, because if you're watering the leaves, you're contributing to the moisture that the fungal disease or mildew is thriving on. Same thing with tomatoes and blight. Airflow is your friend. So we always prune our tomatoes about 18 inches off the ground. We take off all the foliage on the lower part of the plant to allow airflow near the ground, and that helps to mitigate any potential blight issues. As far as composting, simple advice I have, do it. Make sure that your browns are relatively equal. Greens are high nitrogen, browns are high carbon. So if you've got hay or wood chips or something like that, that's high carbon. If you have greens from food scraps or any kind of animal manure, those are high nitrogen. You have to have a balance between the two. If your compost pile is not working very well, you can inoculate it with a starter, a combination of bacteria and stuff that'll help the composting reaction. But the other thing, almost all composting that people do is aerobic composting, meaning it needs air and needs oxygen. So you need to make sure that you're giving oxygen into the pile. There's a couple ways to do this. One is to use something like a garden fork and turn it over. You can also basically drill holes in it. If you get something called a garden auger, which we have shown on our website, if you go to our blog and search for auger, AUGER, you'll see what I'm talking about. But you can actually use a garden auger in your compost pile. This is drill holes in it to allow for air to get into the pile, which will accelerate the composting action. All right, so that was about 3 questions. I think I answered for Lori. Carolyn says, I have big problems with broccoli heads forming. I plant broccoli varieties that should have big heads, but get very small heads and no branching heads. When the I feel for you. I've had that problem before. I'm not exactly sure what causes it. I'd have to do some more research. My guess is it's some kind of nutrient deficiency, even if it's minor. The good news is that most broccoli, even the kinds that form a big head, after you cut off the head, should form side shoots, often referred to as florets. There's some varieties of broccoli that don't really form a head. They only form florets, but the florets are actually much more tender and tasty, in my opinion. So if you keep, make sure that it's watered and has good compost, or fertilize it if you need to, or whatever. But as long as you let this keep growing and keep trimming them, then you should have be able to have produce harvested from your broccoli. Kate asked, do you plant beets and turnips from seeds? Yes. That's the only way to do it. You're not going to find beet or turnip starts at the store. So they grow relatively fast, so it goes pretty quick. Beets actually, they're like 50, 60 days. So plant them now and you'll have them as the nice fall weather is arriving. It says also, do you eat the turnip leaves? Yes, turnip greens are similar to mustard greens. They can be, depending on the variety, they can be slightly spicy, but if you basically saute them in a pan, particularly with bacon, it's absolutely delicious because it's bacon and everything is good with bacon. So, but there's lots of different ways that you can fix turnip greens just like you would other greens. So highly recommend you try it. The key, though, if you're harvesting any green from a root crop, don't harvest too much. The general rule is you don't want to harvest more than about 10%, certainly not more than 20% of the foliage off the plant, because if you take too much of the leaves off, you're taking the solar panels off the plant, right, that it's using to collect the energy in the root. Productive, so don't want to do that. Jan asked, any suggested fall crops for growing in containers? Yes, any kind of leafy green, lettuce, kale, collard greens, Asian greens. What am I thinking here? Things like arugula and mache and all those other kind of greens. All those are really good. You can grow carrots, even beets in containers. I mean, really, you can grow almost anything in containers if you've got good soil and sun and all the other things that they need, right? So I'd recommend trying to do everything that you can that is a relatively compact plant in containers. Things like broccoli and even cabbage you can do in containers. So Natalie asked, for things like kale and mustard greens, are they best direct sown or started indoors? It depends on what time of year you're doing it and what you're trying to accomplish. Typically, I'd say direct sow them. Don't mess with starting indoors. But if you wanted to have kale really early in the year, you might need to start it indoors and then transplant them outside. However, they do pretty well in cooler temperatures, so you can plant them pretty early in the spring and they'll grow fine. In the fall, it's kind of a different consideration because you can plant them now anytime. And as long as they get mature, like the winter comes and they're going to be fine. Kale and collard greens in particular are very winter hardy, so they can just sit out in the garden and they won't be growing much, but if they're mature, they'll just sit there and it's like cold storage in the garden. You don't have to keep them refrigerated. They're just ready whenever you need them. You go out and pick some leaves. And then what happens in the spring, if you have harsh winters where it actually kills back the foliage when it gets really cold like we have here, they don't pull them out. Plants will resprout from the base of the plant and they'll be some of the first greens you have in the spring. So I recommend that you give that a shot. I'd highly recommend growing kale and collard greens and stuff like that. Planting those now and let them grow into the winter. And you can do your winter garden, have fresh greens during the winter. Bev asked, do you have specific suggestions for fall gardening containers? I already made some recommendations on types of plants. The one thing I'd mention is just be aware of how big the foliage, like what grows above the surface, how big that gets. Be aware of that when you're planting multiple things in the same container, because you don't want them to crowd each other out too much. But again, you can use differential timing. If you grow radishes, you can put radishes with just about anything in a container, and then you're going to be able to harvest that thing mature before the other stuff in there is likely very big, especially if it's something like lettuce or slow growing like carrots. So that's another option that you have. Jan asks, where can you get row covers? You can get them from garden and farm supply stores, online particularly. You can get them from places like Johnny's and other places like that. There's lots of places. Any kind of greenhouse supply store, they will have row covers. Typically, it's going to be like farm supply for commercial growers because they use them a lot. Kate asks, I was thinking of planting potatoes. Can I do this in the fall or should I wait till spring? I've also seen potato bags sold online. Do you recommend those or just plant in the ground? I haven't done potato bags. You can grow potatoes in just about anything as long as they have good soil to grow in and they are covered. If they're not covered and the potatoes come to the surface, they'll get greened and they won't be good. So I'd recommend just doing them in the ground if you have the space. Yes, you can plant them in the fall. Well, late summer. If you wait too long, then you won't be able to get a harvest, or you'll only harvest small potatoes. But if you plant here soon, we're going to be harvesting potatoes as well as planting more potatoes here this week, for instance. So go for it. Beverly says, I live in Zone 8 in Georgia. Just bought my fall seeds from you last night. Thank you very much, Beverly. I want to start the seeds in starter pots. What's the best way to do that? If you're talking about like in seedling trays, or maybe even small pots or something like that, that's fine. I would say that there's not much reason to do that if you're going to plant them into the garden. Just plant them into the garden now. You don't need to put them in a seedling tray or something else right now, in most cases, unless for some reason it's just easier for you to water them in the seedling tray than in the ground. But you have to realize that there's always some degree of transplant shock when you transplant a seedling into the ground. And so if you can plant two seeds, one in a seedling tray and one in the ground right now, the one in the ground that doesn't get disturbed is probably going to mature faster. So take that for what it's worth. The other reason you might want to do seeds in like seedling trays or kind of starter pots, if you're going to transplant them into a container that's currently occupied with something you're going to harvest later before you transplant it, that'd be another reason to do it. But if you have space in your garden now, I'd recommend just planting most things in there, unless it's something that doesn't germinate in like really hot soil, and you have hot soil right now. That'd be the only reason to do it, I think. Otherwise, so I think those are the tips that I have for that situation. Holly mentioned I'm new to composting. My compost has a lot of earwigs in it. Is this common, or does it mean my compost isn't getting hot enough? It's a good question. I've seen earwigs in compost before. The best way to know if your compost is getting hot enough or not is to measure the temperature with a dirt thermometer, or like you can get them at a garden store online pretty cheap on Amazon or something. Compost, typically you want it to get up to about 140 degrees. If it's only getting like 100 or something, then most likely the culprit is not, it's one of two things. The first thing, the most likely thing, is not getting enough oxygen, so you need to aerate it. The second thing would be that it has an imbalance between nitrogen and carbon. So you need to make sure you balance out the materials you're putting in. If you're building a pile with a bunch of material at once, the best way to do it is to layer it. Greens, then browns, then greens, then browns, so on and so forth. If you're doing it over time, like, we just take food scraps that we can't feed to the pigs or something, like coffee grounds, stuff like that our animals won't eat, banana peels, whatever, and we just toss them in the compost pile. Every once in a while, though, I'll get some old animal bedding, hay, or something like that, and put that in there as well to try to balance that mix, and then aerate. Obviously, aerate it, like I mentioned, is a big thing. All right, I think I'm on the last question here, and I need to go, so I'm going to wrap this up. Dawn Marie asks, we're digging a new garden bed as much as our regular garden is shaded by flowers and bushes. We live in South New Brunswick, Canada, Zone 5B, way up there. We plan on planting buckwheat as a cover crop this week in order to develop the soil. Will there be time to plant a crop this fall, i.e. lettuce, or should we just plan on next year? I see a few different first fall frost dates, the earliest being September 15th and the latest the first week of October. Thanks, I'm a new gardener. It is a good question. Try using our fall planting calculator and use the most conservative date, which would be the earliest date, and see what it gets you. A couple of things to keep in mind. If you want to use that space, you can use a row cover or some kind of a hoop low tunnel or something like that over it to extend your season and get more harvest out of it. You can make a cold frame and put that over it. Those are the ways that you can extend the season beyond that. The other thing you can do, lettuce typically aren't that big, so you can grow them in pots. And when it gets too cold, you can bring them inside. So it's another option as well. So hopefully that is helpful to you. Okay, I've got to run, folks, but thanks so much for your great questions and your attentiveness. I'm sorry for the technical issues we had earlier in the webinar, but hopefully this has been helpful to you. If you have any other questions, feel free to reply to any of our emails or submit a question online on the website, and we will get back to you. Again, our fall gardening sale is on now. Go to seedsgenerations.com/fall-garden or click the link on the page below the video. On behalf of my wife Shannon and all of our kids, thanks so much for giving us your valuable time in the day, and we hope this has been helpful to you. We look forward to serving you in the future with training resources and, of course, heirloom seeds for your garden from our family to yours. Thanks so much, folks. Have a great day. We'll talk